All right, today we're jumping right into a pretty challenging theory about history, identity, and scripture. It's all based on a specific set of source documents. And our goal here is just to break down exactly what they're claiming, step by step. So, the entire body of material we're looking at is built around this one really provocative question. What if a major, widely accepted historical identity is actually a mistake? It's a huge claim, so let's dig into how they try to make their case.
Here's how we're going to walk through it. First, we'll cover the core theory of identity itself. Then, we'll look at the Bible verses they use to back it up. After that, it's the historical argument they call the Khazar connection. Then, the supposed global consequences of all this. And finally, the search for what the documents call a true remnant.
Okay, let's start with the absolute foundation of the whole thing. The documents build their entire argument on a really sharp contrast between two distinct groups. They define them in very specific ways. So, on one side, you have what the reports call true Yehudim. According to these sources, this group isn't defined just by their bloodline, but spiritually through their faith and their obedience to a covenant. And then on the other side, you've got the false claimants. The documents allege that these are people who claim that same Jewish identity, but, they argue, are not from the biblical tribe of Judah and actually oppose the scriptural truth. Now, this is a really key term you have to understand to get their argument: synagogue of Satan. The reports are adamant that this is not a physical place, like a temple or a building. Instead, they define it as an entire system, a structure of power and belief that they say falsely claims a biblical identity for its own purposes. So, you might be asking, where is all this coming from? Well, the source material claims its foundation is built on a very specific reading of just a few key verses from the Bible. This verse, right here, is presented as the absolute cornerstone of their entire argument. The sources bring this passage up again and again, seeing it as direct, prophetic proof of a group of people who would claim to be Jews, but, according to the text, are not. And this adds another really crucial layer to their claim. They use this verse from Romans to argue that a person's true identity isn't about outside stuff, like ethnicity or family tree. They say it's about what's inside, it's spiritual. This is the core point they make. Real identity is a matter of the heart. Okay, so from scripture, we now pivot to the historical argument. The source documents spend a lot of time on what they call the Khazar connection as their explanation for the origins of most of today's Ashkenazi Jews. So the story presented in the sources goes like this. You have this powerful kingdom in Central Asia called the Khazar Empire. Sometime around the 8th to 10th centuries, the leadership and many of the people convert to Rabbinic Judaism. Then, a couple hundred years later, the empire falls apart. The reports claim that these converts then migrated west into Eastern Europe, and that they are the ancestors of the Ashkenazi population. To try and prove this historical claim, the documents point to three main lines of evidence. They look at anthropology, history, and genetics. Let's zoom in on the specific historical and genetic sources they lean on. Here you can see the specific studies and books the reports cite. For the DNA evidence, they point to work by researchers like Elhaik, Behar, and Hammer, claiming these studies connect Ashkenazi DNA more to populations from the Caucasus region than to Semitic peoples. And on the academic side, they highlight two very famous books by Jewish authors, Arthur Koestler's The 13th Tribe and Shlomo Son's The Invention of the Jewish People, presenting them as basically confessions from within that this Khazar origin story is true. Okay, so we've got the spiritual claims and the historical claims. But what's the big deal? Why does any of this matter now? Well, this next part of the reports is their so what. It's where they connect this identity theory to modern global power. The documents make the pretty stark allegation that individuals who they identify as Ashkenazi Jews hold a disproportionate amount of power in key global sectors. They specifically call out global finance, the media, politics, and big tech as areas where they have dominant influence. And they argue this alleged control creates a real destructive and dangerous cycle. Here's how they say it works. First, a few powerful individuals, who they call false claimants, do something controversial. Then the blame gets pinned on the Jews as a single group. The result? Hatred gets aimed at millions of innocent people, and, they claim, the identity of the true remnant stays hidden in all the confusion. This leads us straight to the final piece of the puzzle presented in these documents: the hunt for this true remnant. If the Ashkenazi aren't the biblical descendants, the sources ask, then who is? So the reports draw this very sharp contrast.
They argue that the historical experience they attribute to Ashkenazi Jews, one of, in their words, wealth and political power in Europe, just doesn't match biblical prophecies, like the ones in Deuteronomy 28 that describe curses of slavery, poverty, and being scattered across the earth for the true Israelites.
So who do they say does fit that description? The documents point towards certain African tribes, specifically mentioning groups like the Igbo and the Lemba. And the evidence they cite is things like the presence of the Cohen modal haplotype, which is a known priestly DNA marker, as well as oral traditions that echo the Torah, and a history of suffering that, they argue, aligns perfectly with those biblical curses. So, to wrap it all up, the sources are very explicit in their conclusion. They state that this entire argument is not about race, it's not about ethnicity. Instead, they frame it as a fundamental conflict between what they see as truth versus falsehood, a battle between a pure spiritual identity and a political one that's been created for worldly power. And that really leaves us with a much bigger question to think about. This isn't about this specific theory anymore, but about history itself. We've just laid out all the claims of a major challenge to a mainstream narrative, and it kind of forces you to ask, how are the stories we tell about our past even built in the first place? How are they challenged? And what kind of proof should we demand when a challenge like this is made?